Enter this place, passerby, and meet those who survived the nightmare. Meet them and learn from them how they built on ruins. Where did they find the courage to renew a covenant with society and invoke hope for humanity's future? I look at their children, I am moved to tears. I think of the killers, I am moved to anger. I think of the victims, I am moved to despair. But then I think of our children, and I am moved to hope. Those were the words delivered by Elie Wiesel on September 11th, 1997, when the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust, was dedicated. Elie served as our honorary chairman and remains an inspiration for our work. Good evening, and on behalf of the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust, welcome. My name is Michael Glickman, and I am the president and CEO of this magnificent institution. We are gathered here in this extraordinary location at the very edge of Manhattan Island because the Museum of Jewish Heritage is New York's contribution to the global responsibility to never forget. On this day and every day, the museum shares the voices of those who perished and those who survived so that we, the living, can gather around their words. As a living memorial, the museum urges us not only to remember the Holocaust, but also carry its painful lessons into our civic and communal lives. The museum answers ignorance with education, stands with the vulnerable, and continues to promote understanding in the face of recent surges in hate speech and hate crimes. I hope we can welcome you back to the museum many times over to participate in programs and explore our exhibitions, learn, contemplate, and engage with the richness and complexity and the magnitude of this community. You will find that while stories and artifacts are core to who we are, even more important is the opportunity to work alongside Holocaust survivors, each willing to help us educate and empower the hundreds of thousands of visitors who pass through our doors. To those of you who are joining us online as we live stream this event, welcome to the museum here in New York. We have the opportunity to welcome Elisha Wiesel to the stage. Since Elie's passing in 2016, Elisha speaks selectively at events and for causes where he feels he can be helpful in remembering his father's message and values. This is an institution who carries those messages and values into each and everything that we do. The format of this evening will be that Elisha will introduce Ariel, our featured speaker, who will tell us about his book and then take questions from the audience. Feel free to jot down notes so that you can ask questions at the end of the evening. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Elisha Wiesel.
One of the things you'll learn if you read Ariel's book is that my father taught his students they had questions they didn't even realize they had. Well, Ariel made me realize I had questions about my father I didn't even know I had. Who was my father when he wasn't with me? And why was it he seemed to come back from his weekly trips to Boston University younger than when he'd left? In a classroom where a student would ask him, "Will you show us the number on your arm?" were there any questions my father wouldn't answer? And how in the world did my father respond when a student responded to a text in the classroom by performing an interpretive dance? These are the questions among many that are stimulated as I read Ariel's book. And of course, I have questions for Ariel too. Now that the book is done, what are you pleased about most with the book? What do you feel you really got right? What are you worried most about in the book? Is there something you feel you missed, something you're worried that might be misinterpreted? And perhaps most important, how has writing the book changed you? Ladies and gentlemen, Ariel is a bold servant of the kingdom of memory, the kingdom my father was so devoted to. He has brought back memories of his own to share with us, of my father, the teacher. There is nobody else I would have trusted with the task of writing this book. It is my pleasure to give the stage to my dear friend, Ariel Burger.
Elisha, when I spoke to your mother and I asked her for stories and her perspective on your father's role as a teacher, one of the things she told me was that when the weather was terrible outside, she always tried to persuade him to stay home and not take that plane to Boston to teach, and he always would go. He was that committed. I'll say more about your beautiful words, but I wanted to acknowledge all of you for being here and being committed in the face of anti-Semitic weather. It was the final day of class, and Professor Wiesel invited students to ask any question they wanted about the course readings, about current events, or about his life. And after several questions, a student named Rachel, sitting in the back of the room, raised her hand and asked, "Professor, how did you go on after the war? What kept you going?" And he said, "After the war, I, together with other young boys, I was taken to an orphanage, and the adults in charge asked us what they could bring us. One boy asked for chocolate, another for a warm sweater, but I asked for the same volume of Talmud that I was studying before the war, so that I could pick up my studies at the exact same line and the exact same word where I had left off. Learning is what saved me. It saved my sanity and my hope," he said, "and I believe that it can save all of us." Elie Wiesel was, of course, known to the world as the author of Night, Nobel Prize winner, Holocaust survivor, human rights activist, confidant of presidents and prime ministers. But he was also a teacher. And if you asked him who he was, he often said, "I'm a teacher first. It drives everything else that I do. It's the last thing I'll ever give up." And the love of learning that saved him also compelled him to teach for decades, first here in New York, then at Boston University, where he taught for close to 40 years, and elsewhere. And in his classroom in Boston, many students of all ages, in all disciplines, from around the world gathered, and they carried questions that extended far beyond the academic. The grandchildren of survivors, the occasional grandchild of Nazi officers, survivors of violence in places all around the world, activists who risked arrest to leave their home countries and come to this country to study with him. This was no ordinary classroom, and the students were anything but typical. This was Elie Wiesel's classroom, and it was a transformative space of learning, and it was a community. He made it a community, saying things like, "I hope that in 20 years, you'll meet one another on an airplane or in a restaurant, and you'll say, 'Didn't we study Job or Kierkegaard 20 years ago in a room in Boston?' And you'll remember the friendships that you formed here." And indeed, many students did. Some of them even got married after meeting in his classroom. To his students, he gave one of the greatest gifts a teacher can give, his belief. He said, to his students' surprise, "I will learn as much from you as you will from me." And he meant it. And when he looked at you, you knew that you had something to contribute, even if it was only a half-formed question or an idea about to be born. In 1996, I enrolled in his class at Boston University for the first time. It was a course titled Jewish Women's Voices, and I was very shy. I sat in the corner, attentive but quiet. Even though I knew him already for several years and I had spoken with him a number of times, I was very intimidated to be in that classroom, and I was hoping that he would never call on me. And I said one word the entire semester, and that only because he asked a question, he looked at me, and he waited. And so I realized he was waiting, and I said the word that was in my mind, and the word was authenticity. And a few weeks later, he asked me to become his teaching assistant. And I declined reluctantly, because I was already on my way to Israel to study in yeshiva, to study traditional texts. And I wrote him a long letter, and I called him afterwards, and he said, "I understand, and I'll wait." And I thought he was being kind, but 7 years later, When I was finished with my studies, I'd become a rabbi. I wasn't sure what I was doing next. I went to see him to ask his advice. And he said, I told you I'd wait for you. Come now and be my TA at BU. So I did, and it changed my life. It is daunting to write about a teacher, knowing that the reader will not see his eyes, hear his voice. And it was those eyes and that voice, after all, which added so much warmth and depth to his wisdom. And when I shared these questions and doubts about writing the book with him, he said, if I know how to find my voice, you can find yours. And with typical astounding generosity, he said, your voice is as important as mine. There's a poem by Mary Oliver that's been in my mind for the last months called The Man Who Has Many Answers. The man who has many answers is often found in the theaters of information, where he offers graciously his deep findings, while the man who has only questions to comfort himself makes music. I don't have many answers. I have questions. This book is my music, and we are here tonight to celebrate this music. Thank you for joining me in this celebration. And here I want to pause to express gratitude. First, Elisha, to you for your beautiful words and your friendship. My friendship with you and Lynn is one of the late-in-life gifts that your father gave me, and it means so much to me, and it's growing. Thank you. This place is a very special and appropriate place to hold this event, and I want to acknowledge the Museum of Jewish Heritage, Michael, and the staff, the entire staff, and especially Miriam Heyer, who helped us organize this event in a place that has meaning, a place that really I couldn't think of another to hold this event. Thank you. My agent, Joelle Del Borgo, is here with us online because, like many, she was trapped in New Jersey traffic. And she midwifed this book and believed in it from the very start in a very personal way, as did my editor at Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, Lauren Ween, who's here with us tonight, also in person, and who's brilliant and whose imprint is on every page of the book. I want to thank Dr. Ruth Westheimer, who also couldn't be with us tonight, but I'm sure is with us in spirit, if not online, for her unbelievable enthusiasm and support for this project and in general in my life along the way. My family's support made all of this possible. Thank you. Now, in 2009, I invited Professor Wiesel to my workplace, which was Federation in Boston. And just for a few moments, I want you to turn your attention to the screen so we can hear from him.
It is the book. We are after all the people of the book. People, they must have a love for the book. And nothing would be better, really. Nothing would be better than to have, let's say, I'm sure you are doing it here, simply once a week at least, to meet and open one of our traditional great works. Simply to study what generations and generations of scholars and students have been created about us, to left us. Sometimes I open one of these books that are old, and I have palpitations, really, of love for all that is in these words. So this is really what we are.
Palpitations of love for learning. This is what we are. This love, as much as his early experience of the kingdom of night, informed and motivated Elie Wiesel's activism. Because he knew beauty, he wanted to share it. Because he admired wisdom, he taught it. Because he was a humanist, he demanded humanism of an often inhumane world. And the love he had for learning for many of us students was a banner lifted above the world's suffering and indifference to suffering. Seeing this taught me and so many of us that education can change our conversations, can change our political realities, can change our destiny. It can heal communities and bring people together across difference. It taught us that in order to respond to the world's great need, it's not enough to look to the contemporary wisdom of the hour. We have to go deeper. We have to dig deeper into great philosophical, literary texts that have outlasted and sometimes transformed or even toppled empires. As he often said, stories and great literature can help us humanize politics and therefore our fate. But can learning really save us? This is one of the questions I explore in the book in great depth. Of course, I want to believe that. And at the same time, I think of something else that Professor Wiesel taught us. He taught us that many of the killers, many of those responsible for the final solution, were highly educated. Many of the SS officers had PhDs. This was the country, the architect of the final solution was the nation of Goethe and Kant. And that wasn't enough. And it's therefore very clear that the learning that he talked about when he said learning can save us is not just the transmission of information. There has to be more to it than that. And the secret ingredient that he spoke of in transformative ethical education, he called memory. We know that memory was Elie Wiesel's great commitment. It was his watchword as he wanted it to become ours. As he stated many times, if anything, it is memory that will save humanity. But what did he mean by memory? He often told Hasidic tales because they capture a certain existential reality that no other literature really does. And he told the tale of a man who was so forgetful that he could never get out of the house in the morning because he couldn't remember what anything was, what the objects in his home were, and what their purpose was. And he went to his master and asked for advice. And his master said, "It's really simple. Put notes on everything. Write down shirt, pants, shoes, cup, fork, and you'll know what to do in the morning." So he did this, and the plan worked very well at first. He was able to get dressed and eat breakfast for the first time in months. He was about to leave for the office when he caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror, and he froze. And he said, "But who am I?" We can have all the information in the world, and we have more than ever before now, don't we? But it's not enough unless it transforms us. It has to be personal, and we must become implicated in what we learn. It has to move us to become ethically sensitive people. And so when Elie Wiesel taught, he shone a spotlight on the human element in any story. For example, when he spoke about Kristallnacht, which we commemorated only a few nights ago, he spoke of a young boy named Herschel Greenspan, whose obsessive, maddening frustration at his parents' plight, trapped between borders, facing certain death, led him to an act of violence which became the spark and the excuse for the night of broken glass. So when we learn about Kristallnacht, we're not reading history and dates, we're seeing a face. And that's what he did always. He gave history and literature a face. And in that face, we could see our own faces, and history and literature became mirrors for us. He did this because ultimately he believed that any one life is worth more than all the words that have been written about life. And the role of learning and the task of a teacher is to make memory contagious. And this does not happen in a vacuum. This happens in relationship between teacher and student, between learners and fellow learners, between students and the authors of great works, even if they lived a long time ago, and teachers and students in particular, and the mystery of masters and disciples held a lot of power for Professor Wiesel. He spoke about it often as a kind of fellowship against the darkness. And he often quoted the law in the Talmud that if a teacher is exiled, the student must accompany the teacher into exile. And vice versa, if a student is exiled, the teacher must accompany the student. No one can break that bond. For Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, the great Hasidic master, and Elie Wiesel's favorite storyteller, the master is like the sun, and the student is like the moon who reflects the master's light into the darkness of evening. But remember, said Professor Wiesel, in Hasidism, it is the student who chooses the master. One student asked, "How will I know who is my master? How will I identify the true master?" And the answer he received, "Look for the one who shares your questions." Professor Wiesel celebrated questions. It was the building block, the foundation stone of his approach to learning and teaching. He said, there is quest in questions. Questions aren't dangerous. Answers are. Answers can be offensive in the face of suffering. Think of Job's friends who had to repent at the end of the story for the answers they offered in response to their friend's terrible pain. Responses might be different. Responses might be better. And the best response, taught Professor Wiesel, is compassionate action. It's always better than any answer, even the most thought-out answer. And he had many questions about God and God's silence, about evil and its manifestations and the dangerous disguises that it wears, about what motivates evil behavior, about the world's madness, and the kind of mystical madness that he believed was its only effective remedy, about language and its limits, and the way that language can be corrupted. He was so sensitive to language, and he felt that words change over time, and words like selection and collaborate should give us chills. I saw today the Oxford English Dictionary chose the word of the year, and the word was toxic. Words have power, words have meaning, and the words that we use can really not only describe but create the world or recreate the world. He had many questions, and we live in a society that privileges answers, and often easy answers at that. But we are also heirs to other traditions of question asking. A story. A young student came to the Hasidic master who was known as the Holy Jew to receive his test in his studies. And he was 13 years old. And after the test, this is what the Holy Jew said to him. When I was your age, I had already mastered more difficult material than this. And by the time I was 18 years old, I was considered a sage. But I started to realize that the way to perfection really is not comprised only of study. And I started to think about Abraham, who was the first to find God and to search for God. And he searched for God in the world. Abraham looked at the sun and didn't find God. He looked at the moon and didn't find God. And he looked at the stars and God still eluded him. Until finally, the presence of God was revealed to him in the not finding. And I realized the truth of not finding. And the truth of not finding informed Elie Wiesel's classroom and our learning together. Being in his classroom, it was very easy to be filled with a sense of wonder because he was filled with a sense of childlike wonder. I often say that he was the youngest person I've ever met. Even if we were studying a text that he had studied a million times before, like the book of Genesis, it was as if it was completely new. And this apparently started very early in his life. He told us a story about when he was a child, and he came home from school. And he said to his mother, "Mama, Sarah's pregnant." And she said, "Which Sarah?" Thinking it was one of the neighbors, someone from the town. He said, Sarah and Abraham are going to have a child. And he was so excited. And a few weeks later, they got to the portion that talks about Joseph and his brothers. And a young Elie Wiesel found himself yelling at the page of the Chumash, of the Bible, saying, "Joseph, don't go to Shechem. Your brothers are waiting to ambush you there." And he believed somehow that his words could make a difference to the story. And you know what? They could. That was his belief, that we can change and shape the story. And he showed us that every moment is new and filled with wonder, every encounter with a text, how much more so with another person, and even with ourselves. The soul is always whispering to us, taught Rav Pinchas of Koretz. So why, asked his disciple, don't people change? Because, answered Rav Pinchas, the soul never repeats itself. When I was 20 years old and I was visiting Professor Wiesel and bringing my questions to him, he once said to me, "Superficiality is the enemy of everything." In a very real way, he brought together the depth of his studies of not only Jewish texts, but philosophy and metaphysics, together with a very canny and wise understanding of current events and political realities that he acquired in large part as a journalist. And he drew connections between these worlds. Example, in a discussion in class about leadership, he said, we can learn from the Hebrew prophets the difference between true and false prophets. What's the difference? False prophets comfort, true prophets disturb. Example, in a classroom discussion about the death penalty, he quoted the Talmud, which says that when murderers abounded in Israel, the Sanhedrin, the great court, exiled themselves from their home in Jerusalem. Why? Because they were the only court empowered to pronounce the death penalty. And they said, better that we be exiled from place to place and not pronounce so many death penalties. Example, a Hasidic teaching from Reb Simcha Bunim, who said, we used to have priests and prophets, and they would tell us when our sins were forgiven. And now as individuals, how do we know when a sin has truly been forgiven? He answered, you can tell that a sin has been forgiven by the fact that you don't commit that sin anymore. And Professor Wiesel asked, can this be true of nations as well? Will nations only be forgiven, and will we know that they are forgiven only when they no longer commit genocide and other acts of oppression? As he brought literature and philosophy to current events, he brought current events into the classroom, and he often asked his students, I'm going to meet the president, what do you think I should talk about? And students were taken aback at first, but he waited, and they offered their responses, and he would come back the next week and report on his meetings. A student asked, what's it like to be at the White House? And he answered right away, it makes me hungry. The student said, why? He said, well, they always order kosher food for me, which I really appreciate. But when I'm speaking, I can't eat. And when the president is speaking, I won't eat. So I always leave hungry. And he added, I always feel like that little boy, that little yeshiva bacher from my little town in Siget when I'm at the White House. And I think he was commenting on the irony that he saw in his life, the juxtapositions. But I also think he brought the same depth of thinking to these political questions that he brought to his Talmud studies when he was young. Albert Camus wrote in his journal of an intellectual who was reviewing his own diary for many, many years at the end of his life, and he saw that for 2 years he had produced nothing, not a single article or essay, and he didn't realize why. He couldn't remember what had happened in those 2 years. And finally he remembered. For 2 years he was researching the Dreyfus affair, trying to develop an informed and cogent opinion. And so he didn't produce anything else. Camus writes, nowadays people make up their minds about important matters based on a single article. How much more so today? And so when civility is endangered and truth is under siege and hatred has reappeared in word and deed, what can help us? I think one of the things that can help us is the depth that Professor Wiesel taught, and a particular kind of depth. One of his favorite phrases was, and yet. Against superficiality, paradox, the capacity to hold two competing values in tension and to avoid the temptation to prematurely resolve complex questions. This is an essential skill and commitment. He believed, for example, in the absolute uniqueness of the Holocaust, that nothing could be compared to it, and it could be compared to nothing else. And yet, he drew universal lessons from that experience that apply to anyone, anywhere. He believed in the particularity of the victims and of every story, but also was committed to the universal consequences and implications. He believed that none of us is alone. As he often said, only God is alone. And yet, he believed that sometimes we need to act as if we are alone, because we're the only one to make a difference in a particular moment. He experienced intense urgency, had trouble sleeping, and yet was very calm. In class, he often said, there's one American phrase that I just don't understand. Relax. How can you relax when you know what's happening in the world? And yet, when I was very stressed out about something, he said, just be. He saw the pain of the world and felt it deeply, and yet believed in celebration. We do not let the enemy define us, he said. He had a finely tuned, generous sense of humor. He told jokes in class often. When a student answered a question well, he said, You get an A+ right away. And that he could laugh taught us that we can keep hope and humor alive even while working to prevent more suffering. And that, in fact, laughter and joy is an essential part of any response. And yet, I think, is an axiom we need badly today. Can we fight against injustice with moral ferocity and yet keep our hearts open? So much depends upon our ability to do so. One final lesson for now. The last meeting I had with Professor Wiesel, he was very frail, very sharp, and he made me laugh out loud several times and brought me to tears once. And we met for about an hour. And when it was time to leave, I usually would give him a hug, but I was afraid of hurting him. And so I held out my hand to him to hold his hand instead. But he pulled me down to him, and he gave me a kiss on the cheek. And then I made to get up again, and he pulled me down again on his other side, and he said very quietly, "One more," and he kissed my other cheek. Those are the last words he said to me. One more. One more. And it made me think a final lesson. It made me think of a teaching of the Kotzker Rebbe that he loved, another Hasidic Rebbe who asked a question about the serpent and the curse of the serpent after the story of the Garden of Eden. The curse of the serpent is that he will crawl on his belly, and he will eat from the dust of the earth. And the Kotzker Rebbe asked, that doesn't sound like a curse, that sounds like a blessing. He'll be able to get food anywhere. He'll never be hungry. And the Kotzker answered, that is the curse, that he will never be hungry. He will never yearn. He will never raise his eyes beseechingly to heaven. He'll have no reason to. That's a terrible curse. Our blessing is that we are hungry. We are hungry for more, one more knowledge, more compassion, more peace in the world, more true justice in the world, more friendship, more learning, more celebration, more wonder, more fervor. We need Elie Wiesel's voice now more than ever before. And I wrote this book for those who won't have the opportunity to sit in class with him, in the hopes that they'll have some taste of that experience through the book. I was able to share early sketches of the book with him, and he encouraged me, reminding me that his first book was rejected by publishers, I think, 17 times. He was excited to see this come to light. And we discussed the need to share his approach to learning and teaching, which was so unique, not only with teachers, but with emerging leaders in many fields. I wrote this book because, as he taught us, listening to a witness makes you a witness. Memory is contagious, and learning can save us. It is possible to change, to grow in courage, indignation, and compassion. I know that he worried often, and in ways that I can't even fully understand, that the world had not learned the lesson. He once said, Kafka talks about a messenger who never delivers the message. That's a terrible thing. But even worse than that is a messenger who has delivered the message and nothing has changed. And I know that he felt that way sometimes, and he wondered, did his words make a difference? Has the world learned? And he tirelessly worked for decades, teaching, giving public lectures, writing op-eds, convening gatherings of Nobel laureates and others, talking to presidents and prime ministers, and teaching his students. And the choice to teach students for someone who had experienced what he experienced, and for someone who is so skeptical of the power of language, was an incredible expression of his hope and his hopefulness, and his moral choice to hope. And all of those activities, the lectures, the op-eds, the writing, everything, constitutes a kind of master lecture that lasted for many, many years. And that lecture is over, but his teaching is not. And now it's up to us to review, to discuss, to build on that lecture. The work he started is not complete, Now let the discussion begin. What did he leave unfinished? What hopes unfulfilled? We are his hope. Thank you. I'm happy to take some questions. I think.
I have a mic for anyone asking a question.
Thank you.
Thank you. I met Elie Wiesel 50 years ago in a lecture at Brandeis, and there he summarized the essence of Judaism and Jews as dayenu. You came to the conclusion, and yet. What kind of a bridge he had to walk through from dayenu to and yet?
Thank you. You know the beautiful Hasidic teaching about keeping two notes in your pockets? One says, the world was created for me, and the other one says, I am just dust and ashes, and you have to know which one to use when. So I think there's something maybe similar here. Dayenu is the sense of celebration, completion, and celebrating every moment regardless of the outcome. And at the same time, I think there's a place for yearning and recognition of how far there is still to go. And one of the big questions in life really is, how do you keep hope alive? And there are two dangers and two possible failures to keep hope alive. One is despair, of course, and the other is complacency. Right? If you see the suffering and you feel the suffering so intensely, you might give up hope. But if you think everything is going well, then you lose motivation to make a difference. So holding fast to that narrow bridge of dayenu and yet and one more, I think was really at the center, and a very difficult thing to accomplish. And Professor Wiesel was able to somehow in ways that have impacted so many people. To celebrate and yet to keep working and keep fighting, keep learning more, keep reaching for more.
Thanks. Did your studies in Israel shed light retroactively on your classes with Elie Wiesel? And when you returned, did they have an effect on your relations with him?
Absolutely. One of the reasons that I declined his invitation the first time around was, frankly, that I didn't feel I had enough to contribute. And it wasn't a false humility. I think it was true. And I really felt that if I didn't dive very deeply into study in a disciplined and extended way, I just wouldn't be able to keep up. And so my studies, first of all, allowed me to access the Jewish texts that had influenced him. And I studied Talmud, which he loved and studied every day. I studied Hasidic texts in great depth, and that was a big part of his life. So I think that it helped me find the language that he spoke, and the language that he didn't always get to speak in public, but that he loved to speak with family and friends. And in terms of shedding light, there were so many teachings that I saw when I would hear him say things in public. I would realize, oh, this is a commentary on a biblical or Talmudic or Hasidic text. And there's a lot of fascinating work to be done in tracing those elements in his teaching.
What do you think would have happened to Elie Wiesel? What type of lifestyle would he have had if he had not gone through the Holocaust?
Well, he was asked that question and answered it. He said, well, I would have been a teacher, but I would have been a teacher in a very different context. He said I would have been a Rosh Yeshiva or the head of yeshiva or a teacher in a traditional yeshiva. And then he sometimes added, I wrote when I was even very young, I don't know exactly how old, Elisha, maybe you know, I think 13 or 14 maybe, he wrote a commentary on the Bible. And he said, I don't know where it is, and I'm glad because I wouldn't be able to share it with pride in retrospect, but I was already writing biblical commentaries, and that was the world that I was living in, and I would have continued. I would have continued my studies, I would have been teaching in that universe. So he remarked on how similar that was to where his life took him. He was a teacher, and in a sense he was a Rosh Yeshiva of a kind of virtual collective of students who now are around the world, but in such a different context, such a different cultural reality.
Before Mr. Wiesel died, social media was becoming, continues to become more and more sophisticated, more and more a venue, a vessel for good news and fake news. And I'm trying to get to the issue of Holocaust denial. I know he was well aware of it, but it's more a question to you. It's like, how do you deal now with people who are launching what seems to be, I don't know if it's successful or not, but it certainly is sustained, where people are saying that the Holocaust did not exist, it was all some kind of a hoax, and more than the message is that they're trying to persuade, they're trying to get people around this idea that the Holocaust did not exist, it was some kind of fabrication. How do you deal with that now?
I'll say three things. First, it's not a new story. It's an old story. Holocaust denial has been around for a long time, as has anti-Semitism and mendacity in general. What's changing is that we have fewer and fewer survivors with us. And you may recall that the title of my book is Witness. And I chose that title in large part because of Professor Wiesel's phrase, listening to a witness makes you a witness, which means that memory is transmittable. And the first thing I thought of when I heard that phrase was, well, that's the response to how are we going to tell the story when the survivors are no longer here. It's really up to us to do that and to carry those stories. Children of survivors, students of survivors, anyone who gets to hear from a survivor. And I'll share a brief story that took place in Elie Wiesel's classroom at the risk of spoilers for the book. This is a very profound moment, and Elisha alluded to it earlier. But in the last day of class, after a sequence of questions, a student raised his hand and asked, "Can you show us your number, your tattoo?" And there was total silence in the room, and Professor Wiesel took off his jacket, rolled up his sleeve, held his arm out, showed the room of 60-something students, rolled his sleeve down again, put on his jacket, and said, "Next question." And when that happened, I saw listening to a witness makes you a witness in action. Every student in that room is now equipped to say, in response to Holocaust deniers, I saw this. I saw this myself. I think that's what we need. I don't know if that's enough, because we also need to amplify that message, but it certainly begins with eyewitness testimony and the transmission from person to person in relationship of those stories and those realities. We are going to move into the next room for coffee and tea and dessert and a book signing for anyone who wants to stay. And I'm happy to schmooze and keep sharing questions. And I just want to say that it was important to me to have the note cards on your seats for you to write down questions, not only for this event, but to take with you as you're reading, because questions are so precious that I worry that you'll have a great question and forget it. It happens to me all the time. So take those with you, use them, share your questions, share your stories and memories. And thank you all for being here.